Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good, Chair. All right, it's glad to be here. I just want to get started pretty quickly. My name is George Sugai, and I have the privilege, if you will, being one of the recipients of Carol J. Neag's endowments, which has really been kind of cool. I really do appreciate the support they've given us, and I say us on purpose because the endowment that I get allows us to support a work group, and not just me personally. Down at the table, when we registered, there was a handout that shared some of the most recent publications and activities that we had, so if you get a chance to look at that. Those of you that work with me, be prepared. There's some errors and typos in there, so I apologize for that because I was working on it last night. But at least we've got a sample of some of the work that we've done. What I'd like to do is recognize that the work I'm going to share with you comes out of the support from the Neag School of Education generally, but from the Neag Endowment particularly. You really need to go down and shake Carol and Ray's hand. They're very generous and very kind. They've been such a wonderful support for the work that we do. And I'm going to try to share with you some of the work that has been stimulated out of that opportunity that they've provided for us. And I do want to acknowledge those of you that are in the room as well as those that were in the larger session. It really is important to acknowledge that what I'm going to share with you isn't just what George Sugai does, it's really what George Sugai gets to brag about. Because the work that I do is really built upon some of the researchers that I work with in this group called the Center for Behavioral Education and Research, and also for the Consortium for Strategic Education Reform. And we do lots of work out in the field with educators and family members and so forth, and really do want to acknowledge them as being part of this particularly important process. If you want any of these materials, please go to PBS.org. It's a website for the National Center that I co-direct. And there are 17, 18 of us who actually run that center, and we've had the privilege of being involved in that for the last 16 years. And if you click on presentations, which is over on the right-hand side, this will be up there in a couple days, so you really don't need to take notes unless you're OC and want to. Everything is there that I'm going to share with you. In fact, you may leave now if you'd like, because everything is there. And you can go to one of the other sessions if you'd like. What's most important about today is that the CBER, the Center for Behavior Education and Research, is one of the things that Carol and Ray asked us to work on building, which is a work group for conducting systematic research inside of schools. And because of Ray and Carol's generosity, we were able to form that group, and we have 7 or 8 really highly talented PhDs who work with us on doing some of this research. So I want to acknowledge that group as well. Okay, so what I'm going to do is share with you just some quick, big ideas and lessons learned around some of the work we've been doing around school climate, behavior support, and in the context of academic achievement. I know some of you in this room are teachers, some of you are researchers, some of you are teacher ed types and so forth, and I want you to kind of think about the importance of school climate, classroom management, if you will, and how it affects what we do. Caitlin's comments this morning were quite important because what she really described is the importance of the classroom and school climate and how we interact with each other and how we appreciate the learning histories that kids, family members, and teachers bring to that setting called classroom. We've had the good fortune of being able to work on our national center now for 16 years. We started in about 1996, and we've been able to touch a number of schools, 21,000 over the last 16 years or so. What's important for you to realize, I came here in 2005, and I kind of like to tell Carol and Ray that because they allowed us the opportunity, the trend line has steepened a little bit. I'm not sure that's exactly true, but it's a really nice correlation to be able to talk about. But the truth of the matter is, we're really proud of the fact that we've touched 21,000 schools. The challenge, of course, is that there's about 100,000 schools in the United States. These are schools that our trainers, our second, third generation of trainers have had the fortune to touch. I actually believe that those numbers are higher because there are lots of behavior support work going on around school climate and school discipline outside the context of the center as well. What's particularly important about today, 2014, and what I'm going to describe for you is that over the years that we've done this work, not only have we thought about school discipline and climate more systematically, but the nation has been challenged to think about it more systematically. In 2014, Arne Duncan and Attorney General Holder got together and shook hands and said that justice has to work with education in a more systematic way around discipline. The Civil Rights, Office of Civil Rights came out saying we have significant issues around disproportionality and around the school-to-prison pipeline. All those have to do with climate. All those have to do with the relationships we have between children and teachers and families. And the last one, of course, is what Caitlin talked about, is what is happening in our schools with respect to school safety, school violence, and so forth. And when Now the Time document came out, it was in response in part to the Newtown event, but at the same time it talked about, are we creating environments where we're helping kids be more socially competent and being able to navigate the more complex society that we have now. So what I would like to do in the few minutes that we have, I know you all want to go out and have pictures taken with your t-shirts on, is to share with you some of these lessons that we've learned. And I'm just going to dabble in a couple things. This may not be as coherent as I like to have it, but I want to touch on a couple things that are important. I like to be called George, so just yell out my name, ask a question if you want to. You don't need to raise your hand. I'm happy to entertain comments or questions and so forth. As long as you're not a faculty member, that's be fine. Okay, moving forward then. I want to share with you, those of you that are teachers in the room or teachers to be or school psychs to be or special educators to be, there's a pretty important book out there I'd like you to look at. It's by Pat Williams, and it's a book that was written about Coach Wooden. I know this is bad to say here at UConn, but he was the basketball coach at UCLA for a number of years. And what Pat Williams did is he wrote a book about what successful organizations do to be successful organizations, not just in the sporting community, but also in business and so forth. One of the comments he talks, one of the statements he talks about is that if we're going to deal with these complex environments called classrooms, schools, and neighborhoods, it's really important to start thinking about ways that more people can get access to what we do. And that may be changing terminology, that may be streamlining, that may be thinking about how we work smarter with what we have available. I want to share with you, again, a little bit of a personal piece just to kind of illustrate what I mean by how important these simple ideas are and how difficult it is to put them in place. Don't read the words, just follow along. Couple, 6 or 7 months ago or so, I went back to California to visit my folks. My dad is 94 at the time of this little story. And I walk into my dad's house and he says to me, "We're going." I say, "Where are we going?" He says, "Well, we're going over to your sister's house and we're going to prune the tree, the apple tree." I said, "Great, I'll go with you. You tell me what to do, I will prune the tree for you." 94, right? So he says, "No problem, we'll go and I'll tell you how to prune the tree." And we're driving over and I say, "You know, I know nothing about pruning." My dad knows a lot about pruning because he's a park supervisor, farmer kind of guy. And he says, "No problem, I'll tell you what to do." Well, we get to my sister's house, he sets up the ladder, he sets it up, and he starts to climb up the ladder. I say, "You got to get out of the ladder, you're going to fall. You're 94 years old," right? And then he says, no, you don't know how to prune trees. You actually said that in the car. You need to follow my directions. I will climb it, you just hold the ladder. So I said, "Fine, I'll hold the ladder, but you can't go up more than 2 steps, right, on 2 rungs. He says, "Okay, I promise not to go more than 2 rungs." As you see, he's up on rung 4 and 5, all right? I turn around, he's off the ladder, climbing in the tree. Now he's 94 years old, right? Now it's a simple problem, you gotta get out of the tree. So I say to my dad, "Gotta get out of the tree. You fall, you die." He says, "You gotta get out of the tree." He says, "Listen, son, I've been pruning trees all my life. There's a simple answer here. I know how to do it, you don't, I'm gonna do it." I said, "That's not good enough." He says to me, turns to me and says, "If I fall out of the tree, I hit the ground, I die immediately." He says, "You climb the tree, you fall, you're disabled for 20 years. Think about that for a second." Now, simple answer, really difficult to chew on, right? Because you're dealing with your father and so forth. I want to argue that the thing that we're going to be talking about school climate, classroom management, so forth, there are simple answers out there. I know people like Jen and Brandy teach the simple answers. I want us to think about the complex environments in which we're asking teachers who are wannabe teachers, school psychologists, and so forth, how difficult of a task that is. So of course we go home, we're sitting down for breakfast, and my dad puts this hat on. I said, "I've never seen that hat before. What is that?" He said, "It's a baseball cap." I said, "It doesn't look like a baseball cap to me." He says, no. I said, "Well, what happened to the bill?" He says, "I cut it off." I said, "Why'd you cut it off?" He says, "It's much easier. I don't have to worry about front, back, on, straight." He calls himself a gangsta. All right, moving forward. So what does this context mean around simple answers, complex solutions, and implementation? I want to start with a brief conversation around school climate and how we've been struggling to define what it is and how to change it. We work in a variety of settings in which we're really struggling with trying to change from a negative climate to a positive, and really operationalizing what does it look like, feel like, and taste, and so forth, and not do what do people say it is. Here's a school that we visited. We walk in, they say, we have a positive school climate. You know, and I say to them, I'm having a really hard time feeling it when you walk into a setting that looks like this. And the Dean of Students says, of course we have a positive climate. It says welcome in the left-hand corner. Don't you feel better about coming in my school? And the struggle we're having in the work that we do is that people are putting up the posters and they're putting out these sort of superficial kinds of efforts to improve the climate, but aren't really changing the interactions and relationships kids and teachers have with each other and when parents visit those settings. We have heavy use of reactive management going on inside our schools, not in your schools, but the schools that we work in which yell and scream is the primary classroom management practice, and excluding kids from learning environments is a problem for us. And that's particularly an issue in the work that we do because we have kids of color, kids with disabilities, and so forth, who are overrepresented in those numbers, who are being the targets of reactive management as well as expulsions. What I want to argue, though, is that school climate is really essential to thinking about how we think about academic achievement. If you look at this classroom, I love this picture, was done in 1985. It shows a bunch of kids have been stacked up in the corner for misbehavior. And the teacher's using this sort of get tough approach to try to maintain control in the classroom. The problem is that this teacher also has to teach to the corner, meaning she has a curriculum, a literacy program, calculus, whatever it's going to be. And it's really difficult to maximize your academic outcomes when you have to teach to the corner, or when the kids are removed from the environment, or when you're using more aversive kinds of procedures to try to gain access to kid engagement. So what I'd like you to think about here then is how do we help schools rearrange their environments to be successful? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I start out with that picture in the beginning. Because Randy and I, Jen, Laura, and others that do the work and work with me, we walk into schools and here's the answer. We have a really simple answer for solving this problem. But when we walk into these settings, they're very complex environments. We work with state departments now. This is a state department someplace in the United States, all right? I kind of made this up a little bit, but you'll get the idea. They say to us, we want to improve school climate. So we say, great, hire Brandy Simons to help you do that. And then what we say, of course, is, what else are you doing to improve and support kids' social emotional development? Well, they say, we want to bring in PBIS, which is the work that I do, positive behavioral interventions and supports. And we say, great, we can provide that for you. What else are you doing? Well, we've got the school improvement grant. We've got the RTI MTSS system in place. We've got safe and drug-free schools. We have school climate efforts going on. We have turnaround. We have character ed. We have alternative schools. We have restorative systems. We have social emotional learning. How are we going to have a chance of implementing effective practices when there are so many activities going on? And what does that look like at the classroom level when you have your in-service days taken up by each one of those? And how do we actually change those settings around? So we ask them, well, tell us how it really works. Do it up on the whiteboard for us. And then we find out that all these organizations and all these initiatives are bumping into each other. And as a result, kids are not benefiting from that particular activity. So what we've chosen to do, going back to the school climate topic, is to say, we know what, we probably really need to step back and think about how we approach this problem. I'm going to brag. Center's been fairly successful. And as you know, the more success you have, the more attention you get. And so we focused primarily on classroom management and school discipline 16 years ago. And now we're being asked to address these issues: substance use, school to prison pipeline, delinquency, restraint and seclusion, disability, dandruff, the whole routine. We're being asked to improve school climate around all those particular topics. As a researcher, we have no data to suggest that we can affect all those areas. None. We have the idea, though, that we can affect some of the things that go on inside of schools. But to make this effective, you have to reorganize how you think about school climate. So what we found is that these are not equal challenges or issues. You can't treat them all the same as a starting point. And what we learned is that some of those fall into the student side, some of those fall into the teacher side, if you will, and some of those are outcomes associated with the interactions of kid to teacher to the outcome. For example, if you look at bullying behavior, and then we send them out of school without a school suspension, and they end up being school to prison pipeline as the outcome. Why that's an important thing to think about is because we want to build systems, and we want to build interventions that allow us to be the most efficient in trying to address that logic model. You can't address school to prison pipeline independent of what adults are doing. And you can't address what the adults are doing independent of the environment in which they work and what kids bring to those classroom settings. So it's really important to start with some kind of way of organizing what we do. Now, of course, the thing that it's really important about those white boxes, which are the same ones I just showed you, is that those are all the negatives, all the negatives. So what Brandy and others have taught me is that, you know what, you can't just talk about what's bad about what's going on. You actually have to provide a solution or a set of remedies. And these boxes across the bottom represent those solutions or potential solutions to compete against those problems. Our research is focusing on how well we can put that bottom row in place. So if we don't want kids to be violating school norms, what do we want them to do? We want them to be better self-managers. We want them to be able to self-regulate better. We've got to match up the alternatives for what the kid needs to do to what they're doing inappropriately. That's also true of the adults, however. They're not free from this whole formula. If we don't want adults restraining and excluding kids, we want to make sure that they have the ability to actively engage kids around good instruction, to be able to teach social skills. If you organize your view of school climate and discipline in a way that aligns kid, teacher, and outcome, you have a better chance of dealing with that organizational cluster that I mentioned before. Bless you. So now you ask the question, well, we understand the challenge. How do you actually go in and change a classroom or school that's negatively oriented to one that's more proactively supported? One thing that's very important to think about when you walk into those kinds of settings and dealing with that challenge is that these negative climates in classrooms are driven by what we call a coercive cycle. If you look carefully at those of you in the room, some of you are too young, but if those of you that do have kids can relate to this picture. My son says, I want ice cream. I say to him very politely, not right now. He says, I want ice cream. I say to him very politely, I told you you need to wait until after we, right? And then he rolls down the window and says, I want ice cream now, child abuse. And what do? If you're a father, what do you do? Father, what do? You give ice cream, right? Because what happens when you give the ice cream? Screaming stops, right? Works. And the kid learns what? Screaming works. So now we've got this interesting cycle. Now every once in a while that's okay, sort of, right? But the bad thing is if it becomes habit, we're in trouble. Because now you're competing against this coercive cycle that benefits the kid and the adult. The problem is it's very short-sighted. Because you drive 3 blocks down the road and you see those 3 golden arches, what does the kid say then? I want fries. I want big fries. And when the dad says, right away, no problem, here's your fries, to avoid the screaming. Some of you are young enough to know how that works and you've done it with your own parents. So I want you to think about how difficult that is to change when you think about classroom settings. So here's what I want you to think about next. So then we sit down and we say, well, what does it look like when you walk through these places that people call or perceive or report as being negative climates? We see lots of kids doing these things. They're non-compliant, they're not attending, they're not engaged, they're not academically, all the negatives. Then we say, well, what are the adults doing in these settings? Well, the adults are responding to those. They're excluding kids. They're saying, shut up, sit down. They're saying, go to the office. They are, right? We remove instruction from some of those kids. We've created this coercive cycle, scream until your daddy stops the car, within the school. Because teachers have learned that if a kid screams, I send them to the office, I feel a lot better. And the kid has learned, scream and you get sent to the office. What a deal. And we want to think carefully about how we're building into that coercive cycle and how difficult it is to change it if you're the father or if you're the teacher or the whatever. The concern we have as researchers is the data are very clear that if you run a coercive environment built around negatives and yell and scream, or negative kind of consequences, we tend to create these kinds of negative outcomes. You actually decrease academic achievement, you do damage the adult-child relationship, you put control outside the classroom and onto the family, into the neighborhood, and so forth and so on. So there's compelling reasons for why we want to avoid it. But the difficulty is that ice cream tastes so good, and a quiet car is so satisfying, right? So then we ask ourselves the opposite question, which is you always have to ask, well, what would a positive climate look like? Well, in these settings, we find that the adults, the teachers, the school psychologists, special ed, social workers, whatever, are doing more of these things. They're having more positive contacts, they're providing more opportunities to learn, they're maximizing the use of instructional time, and so forth down the list. We know what adults do in these settings. We also know that if you create these settings, we have a greater likelihood of kids engaging in more pro-social behavior and academic success is there. The goal, of course, is to create these positive cycles and to avoid the aversive ones. Now remember, sounds simple, difficult to put in place because the coercive cycle is so compelling. It's difficult to break that habit. What our work is about is how do you break that habit? And part of that is trying to create some simple solutions in simple language. So first of all, Brandy, pay attention to this one. You need to be impressed by this PowerPoint. It took me a whole plane ride to make it. There's a message there, obviously, but just be impressed by the technology, right? So our job is how do we shift from a negative climate to a positive, or how do we prevent negative climates or negative relationships and so forth being established? I want to suggest again that creating positive climates is not something you can do with one course here at UConn, or to go out and have a mentor who tells you a little bit in the classroom. It's actually a systemic effort that involves the whole school. It involves all staff members within that setting if this is going to change, because it's very difficult to break the bad habit as well as to establish a new one. All right, so what I want to shift to, though, is if you're going to do that and you want to establish those more pro-social behaviors or whatever, how do we get there? One of the messages I want you to think about is that we want to think about teaching academic skills and social skills the same. A skill is a skill, a concept's a concept, and so forth. A behavior is a behavior. Just that one's academic and the other one is social, right? So I want us to think about what's that look like. So here's the question for you. Look carefully. Is this addition correct? Come on, some of you are math people in this room.
Addition looks correct.
Yes, the measurement guy, of course, answers right away. The computation is correct, but guess what? The concept is wrong. You cannot add elevation to population, right? It doesn't make sense to add those two numbers because the sum doesn't mean anything. But the addition is correct. If you're a teacher, if you are in measurement, what do? You stop and say, whoa, time out. You got part of it, didn't get the whole thing right. Let me reteach you what it means to add and what the concept of addition means and what the sum means and so forth. You go back and reteach. Agreed? Okay, look at this next one. Are these problems correct? We don't have time. I'm going to tell you. On the left-hand side, that one is added correctly. 3 plus 2 is 5, 2 plus 1 is 3. The ones on the right are wrong, but they're all answered in the same way. Has anybody figured out the strategy the student used? Come on now, teachers, critical assessors, come on. 1001, 1002. Very good, you win. The student has said, these all involve carrying. I don't know how to do carrying. I've got my own strategy. 7 plus 6 is 13 plus 2 is 15. 3 plus 4 is 7 plus 7 is 14 plus 1 is 15. They're adding the individual digits together. They've tried a strategy, but it's a misrule. What do you do when a student makes a misrule? You say, good try. Let me teach you how to do carrying or whatever the skill is. You go back and reteach. Agreed? All right. I don't care if it's the main idea of a paragraph or some complicated thing about standard deviations. If a kid makes a mistake, you reteach it. You don't send them to the office. You reteach. One more. This is what my son does. So you all know, right? The question is about finding the hypotenuse of a triangle. The teacher wrote it, find x, and my son found it. Question to you is, what do you do as a teacher? Is this non-compliance? Is this trying to get attention? Is this, I know the answer, but this is silly, why are you asking me? Or I don't know the answer. What do? You assess, right, to figure out why the kid has made that mistake. So I want you to think about how we treat social behavior errors now. Here's an example. Oops, I'm sorry, time out. So when we did this, if you want to teach hypotenuse of a triangle, you define it. C squared equals a squared plus b squared. I show you how to do it on the whiteboard or your iPad or whatever. I say students go practice it on this worksheet. I check for errors if there are, or corrects, and if there are any errors, I go back and reteach and so forth, right? And I give praise. I change the items to make sure the kid can do it across settings, whatever. That's basically the basic teaching model we do here at the Neag School of Education. Think about this situation. I have to clarify, kids on the right, teachers on the left. Sometimes people get mixed up on this picture. It's at the end of a chain of an interaction. The teacher has just said the following. I hate this foolish school and you're a dumb fool. Now if you're a new teacher in the room, don't know how to fill in the blank, ask a veteran teacher in the room what goes in the blank, all right? In this situation, how does the teacher respond? The The teacher responds with, that is disrespect. You have violated section 7, paragraph 2 of the code. You need to go to the office and tell the principal you are disrespectful, and you will not come back to my class until you are respectful. Now in this example, it's exaggerated obviously to some degree, we assume that punishment is going to teach the kid to be more successful in the next time there's an interaction. It assumes that the teacher is going to have a better way of being able to address the problem when it occurs next time. When a social behavior error occurs, we tend to punish. Not you in this room, the people I work with do, right? We tend to punish. We assume that a consequence is going to be sufficient to joggle the kid's mind and they're going to figure out how to do it right the next time. But the truth of the matter is we never send kids to the office for getting a problem wrong on their math sheet, right? We don't say, you know, you added those numbers wrong, go to the office, you take this discipline referral with you. We don't do that, we reteach. But we tend to use punishment as the first line of response to a problem behavior. Again, that's not to suggest that that behavior is acceptable and that there shouldn't be a consequence for it. But the next time we want to prevent that from happening by doing what? Teaching better ways to interact, teaching better ways to express feelings, whatever those things are, being able to have another strategy for dealing with escalations and so forth. We need to have that kind of stuff in place. We want to teach social skills, and if you are teaching social skills now, if you're following the coursework that Brandy and Jen and others do, we really do focus on teaching social skills in the same way we think about academic skills. Because we know that that's how important that is. Academic success improves self-concept, social skill success does the same thing. We've got to improve that capacity to do that. All right. So another little book I want to share with you. If you're a new teacher in the room, you need to grab this. I think it's a cool book. I usually don't promote books, but this is a cool one. It's really small. It's only 100 pages or 200 pages, so you can get through it quickly. Big print, so it's easy. But I really like it because it really has application to this world of school discipline and climate as well as classroom management. And what this book is about is the power of habit. And what he argues is that habits are associated with 3 critical elements. The behavior itself, a cue that signals you're going to do something, and a reward that acknowledges that particular behavior, if you will. So he gives these examples, and I've added some of our own for school's context. You walk into the kitchen, you see the cheesecake over here and the carrots over here. The cue is, I know I should be eating the carrots, but the cheesecake is a powerful cue, right? You eat the cheesecake and you feel what? Good, a little guilty, but good. If you do that over and over again, it becomes very difficult to change that habit. You walk in, you're heading to your treadmill, but then there's the remote. And you say, I'll just check and see what's going on CNN or one of the shows. You turn it on, you get entertained, you get engaged, and the habit is shaped. The more and more you do it, the more difficult it is to change, when instead you should be on the treadmill. Same thing is true in the behavior world. Kid teases another kid. The kid hits when teased. Teasing stops. Hitting becomes the habitual response over time. Again, it starts off as sort of random and sort of infrequent, but if it's used over and over again, it becomes habit. Scream until your daddy stops the car. Keep remembering that. Same thing if the work is too difficult. I hand him a worksheet with 1,500 math problems on. He says, this work sucks. I take it away and say, you're obviously not ready to learn. I take the work away. He says, work for me, right? And the work is removed. If that becomes part of the way of succeeding in classrooms, it becomes part of the habit. As Brandy always tells me, well, that's fine. Then start thinking about that. How are you going to replace those misbehaviors with appropriate skills? Like a healthy diet, carrots, like exercise treadmill, like problem solving when you're teased, like asking for assistance when the work's too hard. We want to promote those skills, but guess what? They're really hard to promote when the habit is there. What would you rather have, carrots or cheesecake? Right? When you walk into these settings, bless you. Right? How do you teach those things? I want to suggest that one of the challenges we have in classroom management school climate is that the habits are so ingrained, it's very difficult to change to a more proactive kind of a model. So how do we get there? I love this part of the book because it kind of aligns how at least Brandy and Jen and I think about the world, but it also describes a little bit about the challenge of trying to compete with these habits. He argues, and I think he's right because I agree with him, right, is that there are things we can do to try to change these habits. If you want to change the habit, you got to teach the alternative. What are you going to do instead? And you've got to add cues that promote the likelihood of doing that. And you got to put the cheesecake away. Don't buy the cheesecake in the first place. There are strategies you can engage in early to promote the pro-social and avoid the negative stuff. But that ain't going to happen if there's not some kind of feedback from the system about how you've done. You know, if I think about Alcoholics Anonymous and I think about, Weight Watchers and so forth, it's heavily driven by support systems and cueing systems and so forth. Those are all parts of ways to acknowledge that habits are difficult to change. But you didn't think that this session was going to be on a personal improvement system. All right. So I want you to think carefully about how important it is to teach social skills. So to finish this section, I got 2 more to go, I want you to think about this problem. Okay, so anybody been to Boulder, Colorado in this room? Have any of you been to the Dark Horse Inn? Okay, then I can tell you the story then. All right, so this is a bar. For those of you who don't recognize, it's a bar. And on the left-hand side, you can't see very well, it says women. On the right-hand side, it says men. If you're coming from Connecticut and you go to this bar, as you know, bars are places where people drink and people have to go to the bathroom. If you had to go to the bathroom, which door would you go to? Before you answer, note, there's a hand pointing to the other door. So the women door points to the right and the men door points to the left. Which door would you go into? So let me show you how this works. So if you had 0 or 1 drink, you're probably going to ask somebody, which door do I go into? Or you're going to watch to see how another person does it. That's smart. If you've had 2 to 5 drinks, like Chris has had, right? Then you try to look inside the door and see if you can get a hint about which door to go into, right? Because you want to stick your head in there and look. If you've had 6 or 7 or 8 drinks, you just go in and go, because you're going to be right half the time. Now, in bars, we want that to happen, because the people who live in Boulder like to see how people in Connecticut figure it out. The truth is, women's on the right, men's on the left. I know, wow, right? And if you've had the influence of alcohol, how much more difficult, or maybe you're less inhibited, I don't know what the word is, but in bars we want errors to occur because errors are entertainment for the Boulderites. That's how it works. In schools, we don't want errors to occur. A number of years ago, I worked in Guam, on the island of Guam out in the Pacific, and I asked this elementary school, what's the biggest problem you're encountering this week? And they said, we have kids urinating in the bushes. Really? Urinating in the bushes. What do you do? Oh, we send them to the office. You send them to the office? Yeah, it violates Section 7, Paragraph 2 of the code in our discipline handbook. I said, really? Who are these kids? Oh, they're off-island kids. Right? And they're kids who come from a culture in which what? Urinating in the bushes is okay. But they're assuming that being sent to the office, they're going to learn the ritual, the rule for that particular setting. It'd be much cooler if the kid came to the school and you said, welcome to our school. I know you're not from this area. Let me teach you how our bathrooms work. In schools, we don't want kids to learn by trial and error on social behavior. We want them to have a chance of success. Now in bars, being a teacher, if I own this bar, which is not going to get, my business would probably plummet, but if I was, because I'm a teacher, I'm going to sit the bouncer at the front door and I'm going to tell the bouncer, you know what I want you to do? When anybody comes in from Connecticut, you need to teach them the rule. Women is on the right, men is on the left. Teach them the rule now because we don't want them making mistakes. But bars are not set up for that. They are set up for errors. Okay, so I want you to think about this notion of school climate as something you have to teach explicitly. You can't leave it up to chance. And I gave you the extreme of Guam, right? And I gave you the extreme of Boulder. But that's true of Hartford versus Windham versus Fairfield. Well, all the different rules and rituals and ceremonies and so forth that vary by family, by culture, by whatever. It's really important to remember that because the social skills that we value in one setting may not be valued or learned or taught in another setting. And our kids fail. And we end up finding them do what? Ending up in the office because of those failures. All right. Somebody sent me this after I showed this and said, there's a sign that says, please check if you flush, thank you. So you'll see that somebody put checks all over it. And I considered it data collection, but I think it's not intended for that, but anyway. Okay, so let me do one little piece around culture, then one more piece around a little bit about data, and then we'll stop. And that is, we've been spending quite a bit of time working with others, a little bit within our own group, focusing on culture, trying to deal with issues around disproportionality and so forth. And one thing we're realizing is, at least from our perspective and our logic model, is that it really is important to think about the learning histories that people bring to our settings. So those of you who might have seen this before, just keep your mouth shut for a second. But I want to ask those that haven't seen this next picture to answer the following question. What state in the United States was this picture taken? All right, so let me help you with that. My son is on the left-hand side. We were on a cross-country bicycle ride, he and I, 21, he's 21 at the time. We started in Portland, Oregon, and went to Washington, D.C. So let me say it again. Which state do you think this picture was taken? So then my son says to me, when we stop to get water or whatever, he says to me, Dad, how far away is the wood? How far away is the wood? I say, no, son, it's not how far away the wood is. They have firewood for sale. Got milk, right? Got firewood here. It's firewood, all right? I won't ask you to answer out loud because it might be embarrassing, but the answer is we were in Maryland when this picture was taken, right? Now I want you to answer the question in your head, why did you say Idaho? Why did you say Alabama? Why did you say Coventry? Whatever you thought, right? Why did you think whatever you thought? What is it about your experience as a human being individual that caused you, shaped you, led you to the assumption that it was whatever you thought? Did anybody get Maryland? I know some of you did because you've seen this before. Did anybody choose Maryland? All right. But it's Maryland where this picture was taken. I want to suggest again that in the world of school climate, classroom culture and so forth, it's about being clear about what your individual learning history is, your own individual culture and multiple cultures, and how those interact with these other cultures that are out there. It's very clear to us that this topic of culture is influencing climate and discipline and so forth. Look at this picture. This is a principal's office. There are 3 kids waiting to see the principal who's been sent there. 1 kid has been sent to the office for saying the S-H-I-T word, another kid for saying the F-U-C-K word, and the 3rd kid for saying Christmas. Now I want you to answer the question, why was the kid who's been sent to the office for saying F-U-C-K? I actually don't care so much about well, I do care about the Christmas one. But each of those decisions about sending a kid to the office or responding to a problem behavior is driven by those learning histories that are attached to the community, the family, the teacher, the school, and so forth. One thing I don't think that we do very well in our teacher training programs in general is prepare people for the bumping of cultures, the misrules that are established, and what happens when we don't appreciate that. We end up saying it was Idaho and not Maryland. We jump to the conclusion about what that looks like. And we haven't done the research yet, you guys can do that, is saying, what are those critical causal factors that contribute to these kinds of decisions, and to what extent can we influence those? Because we're really concerned about this because it's showing up in our disproportionality data. It's showing up in our school-to-prison pipeline. It's showing up in our alternative schools. It's showing up on data that suggests that if you are African-American guy and you have a disability, you're 4 or 5 times more likely to be excluded from school. What is that about? Is that a firewood problem? Is that an instructional problem, and so forth? And your point's really important because what you said is it's about language, it's about cultural rituals and behaviors, it's about how we perceive, it's all those kind of elements. It's a very complicated question, but you got to start by saying, what does your learning history look like? And how does my learning history, and what kinds of stops do I have to put in place before I jump, right? I'll always remember my first teaching job before I came here was at the University of Kentucky. I walk into the room, I was teaching a course on ed assessment for special education teachers. No offense, but true story. 25 young white women in that room. I walk in, the room goes silent. It's just silent. I look around, I hand out the syllabus, and then I say, hey, let's get started. And they'll go, phew. And of course, I'm from California, so I don't care. So I say, what just happened? Why did all the air come out of your lungs like that? And they said, well, we can understand you. I said, what do you mean you can understand me? Can't you understand California? What is this, right? I'm a 3rd-generation Japanese American, and I speak English as my primary language. But my appearance immediately caused them to assume I was an international student, and I couldn't speak English. I was here to teach the course because that was my GA was about, right? So they jumped to these conclusions based on appearance, based on language, or whatever. So what I tried to do in those little snapshots is to suggest to you that what we've been focusing on is thinking about climate and culture and classroom settings as a way to try to improve academic outcomes, And we know that if you can't engage kids socially or academically, both of those are going to be affected. We tend to, meaning Brandy, Jen, and I, and the others I work with, tend to work with schools that are in trouble, that are heavily into the scream and tell your daddy stops the car. So we're always focused on how do we kind of change these more difficult settings. I would love for you to think about this from the prevention perspective. How do we avoid ourselves getting into these kinds of situations? I described for you a little bit about thinking about climate as this interaction between kids and staff. I've made a couple comments about how important it is to think about teaching social skills directly and don't leave it up to chance. And the third thing is, I said, your own individual learning histories bump into the learning histories of families, kids, and your colleagues, and so forth. So to finish that off, I just want to end with these kind of quick little things from my Pat Williams reading. And that is, it's really important to think about setting high expectations for yourself as well as your children. And don't assume that kids walk in with a certain set of skills or deficits. But instead, we've got to think about accumulating this vast kind of pool of knowledge and being able to become much more efficient in how we do our work. So I want to show you a quick little thing about data. I'm from California. I don't know whose car this is, but I thought, okay. So I showed you the thing about the 21,000 schools, but what I want you to notice is what you should be saying to yourself is, that's great, George. You guys have touched 21,000 schools, but so what, right? And this is just one of the so whats. I'll give you the next one in a piece in a second. But each of those bars represents a state. The total bar represents how many schools are implementing or have been trained by trainers. This is in our database at the center. And the blue part represents those schools that are implementing Tier 1, which in our three-tiered logic, Tier 1, which is school-wide efforts, with fidelity. We have 2 or 3 fidelity tools that we use to check the accuracy of the implementation of evidence-based practices. One of the things I want you to think about is that, yes, it's great to look at kid outcomes, but you got to look at how well we're implementing the practices in order to say anything about our success in working with those kids. We obviously have some states that are doing really well, and we have some states that don't know what they're doing. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. And if you're in the Neag School of Education now and getting ready to go out and you want some career counseling about which states to move to, connect with Brandy. She'll tell you which states you should move to. Because there are some that are doing a really good job of implementing PBS structures and others that you may not want to go to. I'm kidding. We rely heavily upon the research side. I haven't shared much of the research with you, but over the last 10 years in particular, Johns Hopkins and the University of Nebraska and some other places have done a number of randomized controlled trials and some quasi-experimental studies to document the effectiveness of what I've been describing for you. And so we're pretty happy about this. I'm willing to bet you my wife's next month's salary that if you did PBIS well or behavioral support structures well, you can produce these outcomes. I qualified it. You got to implement well. You got to make it culturally and contextually appropriate and so forth. If you do that, you're going to have an increased chance of producing these outcomes, which is what Catherine Bradshaw and her colleagues have been able to demonstrate empirically. Again, the messages need to be simple if we're going to have an effect. This is one of the messages that's really important to the work that Jen and Brandy and I do. We really like to think about support as being provided in a model of intensity. This comes out of the prevention literature. Basically what it says is everybody needs to get access to good diet, lots of sleep, and exercise. You do those 3 things, you're going to be okay, generally, right? If you smuck up on any of those, you might need a little extra help with some targeted interventions, a support system. That's why I married my wife. And third, if you have real problems with maintaining those skills, you might need some high-intensity one-on-one supports, right? And we know that kids have these different profiles in how they do. Some things really well, some things not very well. And it's kind of like if you teach reading, the core curriculum is Tier 1. Some kids need small group assistance on top of that, and some kids need one-on-one assistance to be successful. That's true on the behavior side as well. A positive climate does pretty well with most kids. Some kids need a small group counseling session, and some kids need individualized assistance. So we like to think about organizing these interventions along that continuum. We also like to say to new teachers, new administrators, and what have you, it's not just about the tricks of teaching, the tricks of classroom management. It's about how the systems work together. And there are 4 important elements to this system. One of them is you got to know where you're going, right? If I teach this, you need to answer the question, what should the kid be able to do as a result of this instruction? I need to have data to judge how well we're getting there and whether or not we're there or not. I need to make sure that this is the best intervention money can buy, and I need to make sure that the adults are competent at implementing that practice. We do this all the time in special ed. Current level of functioning, long-term objectives, IEP interventions, and we turn the IEP over to teachers to implement. We do those 4 things. When I go to the doctor, when my dad goes to the doctor, what do? We take information, data, blood pressure and so forth. We say to the doctor, my pulses and my blood pressure is this. How many more minutes am I going to have to live? Outcome. What can I do to intervene? Practices. How can you help me get there, doctor? Right? We ask those 4 things. In schools, I'm not sure we give equal priority to all those. We tend to look at the practices circle only. What's the best shoebox? What's the best binder to be able to buy? I want to argue that we've got a problem of too many binders on the shelf, and we're not looking at those 3 other elements very well. All right? The goal, of course, is to create environments that we call positive school climates. Truth of the matter is, I think we can learn a lot from the business literature about what that means. It means that we have a common language that accommodates the different languages that are in that setting. It means we have to have a common vision about why we're here and what we're doing. And we have to have a common experience, or routine, or set of procedures or routines, and that all of those are culturally sensitive to those who participate in that community. And that's where leadership falls in place. And I don't mean just the principal, I mean shared leadership or distributed leadership across the school. So one last thing, then we're done. And going back to my dad again, so I apologize for that part of it. And that is what I've shared with you, or what Brandy and Jen and I like to call the fundamentals. The fundamentals to classroom management, the fundamentals to school discipline, or whatever. What's the smallest number of things that are the most important to share if you only have 45 minutes, right? There's a lot of stuff behind it, the simple messages, but you want to stay close to the fundamentals. The fundamentals is where we start. You know, if you think about most things outside of teaching, when you get good at something, it's probably because you're good at the fundamentals, right? I like to play billiards. I know that there's fundamentals to that. One is you keep the cue level. Second thing is you take 3 warm-up strokes. And the 4th thing is you always follow through. Fundamentals, right? You can do fancy shots as long as you got those fundamentals down and you're better at it. Same thing is true of tennis, following through, sharp knife for cooking, et cetera, et cetera. What are the fundamentals of classroom management? What are the fundamentals of school discipline? Wooden's message, he says his success is that he had his team just doing layups over and over and over again. Because once the fundamentals are down, the more complicated things become easier. So I want to share with you, I need to go over here for a second, one last picture. So these are my parents again, 2014. They're really cute. We were in, anybody been to Monterey, California? Okay, a place called Lovers, whatever it's called, Lovers Point. So my dad turns to me and says, you gotta have our picture taken. I said, okay. So we took a picture. But I want to show you another thing here. And I'll talk it through as we get there, I hope. Here it is. Yep. So I go home. My dad has had triple bypass heart surgery. I mean, he's an old guy, his heart's falling apart, so he had surgery. So I call home, Connecticut to California, and I say to my dad, my mom picks up the phone, and I say, how's Dad doing from his surgery? And she says, oh, he's doing fine. And being a data guy, I say, how do you know, Mom? And she goes, I'm looking out the window right now. He's riding his bicycle. I said, wait a minute, Dad doesn't have a bicycle. And she goes, oh, yeah, he does. He went for a walk on one of his rehab walks, and he saw a bicycle on the side of the road, and it said free on it. So he brought it home, fixed it up, oiled the chain, and he's riding his bicycle. So I go home, whenever the date is, and I say, Dad, Mom said you can ride a bicycle. Prove it to me. So he gets on his bicycle, and he's riding this bicycle around. I say, you know what? You need to raise the seat, because your legs are... He says, no, no, no. I can put my feet down in case I start to fall. I said, you need a helmet. He says, no, no, no. I don't need a helmet because I only ride around on the grass in the backyard. This is a 95-year-old guy, right? He's got the fundamentals down. You know, it's that old thing about once you've learned to ride a bike, you've always, you know, right? He's doing it. However, I also believe he's successful because he has help. He has a coach. He has the system in place to support that. So he stops because over on his left, the coach walks in and says, get off that bike, we gotta go. And then he does the following, smiles, and obediently puts the bike away. Now the reason I like that story is because I really do believe the fundamentals are important. And the more practice you are at the right way of doing the fundamentals, the greater the likelihood you're going to maintain those. The better the likelihood that the habits are going to be established. If that makes sense to you, and if you're interested, you can always go to these two websites to get more information. You can always connect with me. If you have questions that you want to ask me, please contact brandy.simonson@uconn.edu or me, and I'd be happy to respond. Brandy and Jen and Allison and these people over here are people I work with. They're the people I steal all this information from, and they make us look good. But I'm happy to respond to anything around classroom management and school discipline. These are some of the sampling of some of the things that we've been focusing on. So thank you very much for your time. Go enjoy. Go put your t-shirt on.